Francesco Corselli is an Italian composer born in Piacenza in 1705 who developed his career in the Duchy of Parma and in Venice before moving to Spain in the 1730s to become the chapel master of the Royal Chapel and remain here for 40 years, composing both for the stage and for the church. As Professor Reinhard Strom pointed it, Francesco Corselli is virtually unknown for most people precisely because he moved to work to Madrid, which was part of a territory which was regarded as periphery of Europe, especially of the European music at that time. The opera was composed for a dynastic wedding, the wedding of an infanta of the Spanish monarchy, Maria Teresa Rafaela, with the Dauphin of France. And this wedding took place in 1745, and as the beginning of the celebrations in December 1744, the city of Madrid organized this opera to celebrate the engagement. And the libretto was surely selected by the Queen Elizabeth Farnese, and he commissioned the chapel master, Francesco Corselli, to write the music. And Corselli wrote the music for a troupe of mostly Italian musicians, Italian singers working for the court at that time. There is no evidence of this opera being performed afterward during the 18th century, so it was written for this celebration, and as was common for most operas, they were an event for one occasion, and normally they were not performed again. It was quite exceptional for an opera in the 18th century to be performed more than once. The manuscript is preserved in the archive of the city of Madrid precisely because it was the city of Madrid who paid for the production 300 years ago. And we preserve both the manuscript score and most of the performing parts, but not all of them. And especially the manuscript is complete, but the orchestration is not completely detailed because very often we have indications that oboes have to be played, but they are not written down. They have to duplicate the violins, but clearly they cannot play the same sound of the violin because the register of the violin is bigger, so we have to adapt. And also we know from other works of Corselli that even when oboes were used in an aria, normally the oboes were used only for the ritornelli and not for the parts where the voice was singing. So we have to really adapt the instruments to the music, but that's the main work that I have done as an editor. I will start explaining that the libretto was written by Pietro Metastasio, who was the most important, I would say, the most important librettist in the history of opera, because although he only wrote 27 librettos, these were set to music by more than 300 composers in about 900 versions throughout 100 years. So we're talking about a librettist that was really the spine of operatic music during a whole century, especially from the 1720s to the 1790s. And that's one of the main attractions of Achille and Sciro. The second reason is that Achille is a very interesting libretto from a dramatic point of view because it narrates the conflict of Achille between love and duty. Achille is hidden in the island of Skyros by his mother because if he goes to the war of Troy, he is known that he would die. So his mother tries to prevent him to going to war. But his destiny as a hero is to go to Troy. So Ulysses comes to the island because he suspects that something is happening there, and he suspects that a young girl that is living with the other girls of the king of the island could be Achilles. So he makes a trick. He puts a number of gifts in the floor. Most of them are dresses and jewels, but also some weapons mixed. And then he organizes a fake attack to the island with trumpets and alarm sound and everything. So everyone runs away, and suddenly Achille finds himself in the middle of this big room with his dress as a woman, with his lyre, and then he throws away the instrument, he takes the clothes off and takes the weapons and goes out to fight for the island. So his real self as a fighter, as a soldier, comes out, and he reveals his identity. Well, the structure of the opera is shared with opera seria. I mean, the opera is divided in recitative and aria. Action takes place during the recitative, and the arias are for the expression of the emotions. So the structure is that whatever happens between the characters create a reaction, emotional reaction in one of them, and this emotional reaction is expressed in the aria. So, like most operas in the time, each opera is a catalog of emotions by different characters. So we have sadness, we have arias of love, we have anger, we have a number of different moment expressions of emotions. That's what makes this music so appealing. Corselli and Handel share a number of issues in common. They're both from the same period, although Handel was 20 years older. And they were both expatriates, so they were born in one country and living in another country and were successful there. Corselli was born in Italy but came to the Spanish court, and here he cultivated most genres of music, particularly opera and sacred music. Not so much instrumental music, but he also has some interesting instrumental music. And he was the most prominent figure in music in Spain during the peak of his career. Of course, Madrid and London were very different, and London was much richer place for opera and for music in general than Madrid, but we can really match both composers. Well, I didn't discover the score. The score is known to be there for a long time. What I did is really think that this score deserved to be performed, and for a musicologist, the most difficult task is really to get your work transferred to society, and the opportunity to do it with Teatro Real is just a dream. But I started to work on Corselli more than 20 years ago, and the first publication of his music was a book I published in 2002. And it was music composed for Christmas. It was a selection of Christmas cantatas for the Royal Chapel in 1743, so the year before Achille and Sciro. So Achille was written around the same time, and I thought it was interesting to explore the opera. And when I started to work on it, I thought it was incredible that this music was unknown, not only for the public, but also for the academics who work on 18th century opera that didn't really know, with some exceptions. And I already mentioned Reinhard Ström, who was probably the first to explore the music of Corselli. In the 18th century, it was common that many male roles had a high range and were written for castrati. And in fact, during the time of the composition of Achille and Sciro, Farinelli was already living in Madrid. But interestingly, this opera no castrato participated in the production, but this was normal. In some places, only women sang, in other places castrati, so there was no absolute rule that male characters had to be performed by castrati. And in fact, the character of Achille was performed by the first Spanish prima donna, Maria Heras, who came from the Spanish theaters, but she had such a wonderful voice that she also sang for these court productions, performing music in complete Italian style. And other singers for the male characters were also, for some of the male characters were also women. But then we have, for example, the King Licomede, the King of Syros, who was performed by Antonio Montagnana, who was the first lyric bass in history, and who had come to Madrid after premiering many roles for Handel and for Porpora, for example, Zoroastro in London. Before Corselli arrived in 1733, I think it was, there were some attempts to do operas, and in fact there are operas in Spanish, but in Italian style, in Spanish tongue, written in the first decades of the 18th century. But it was when Corselli arrived that new productions were made. Some were operas brought from Italy, others were written by Corselli himself, but they were in general exceptional productions. It was not until the time of Ferdinand VI when he commissioned Farinelli to organize an operatic theater for the court. And at that time, Farinelli not only organized operas, but he commissioned operas from different composers in Europe, and even librettos. And Metastasio wrote one of his last librettos for Madrid, Niteti, which was set to music by Niccolò Conforto. The first version of Nitteti was set in Madrid and in 1756. So the peak of Italian opera, or I would say European opera, in Madrid in the 18th century was the approximately 10 years that Farinelli was organizing the opera productions in Madrid. Well, I would say that the main reason is that the codes of this opera are European, or I would say universal. So anyone who likes 18th century music will come here and will identify many things that are familiar. In fact, my theory is that the opera seria, the performance of opera seria, and especially all the librettos by Metastasio, allow for a process of codification of the expression of emotions. So certain resources used by the musicians as regards tonality, tempo, instrumentation, gestures, vocal or instrumental gestures, were repeated from one opera to the other, and this formed the ground of the expression of music that went on in the following century, not only in opera but also in instrumental music.